And so to our sermon for today. It's the fifth and last sermon in our series on the question of overcoming. Today we're going to look at the story of Ruth, that great Old Testament character. Here is a reading from the book of Ruth. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "What does that young woman do, and who does she belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work with me." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she asked him, "Why have you found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So the story of Ruth is a story of someone overcoming the difficulties that life threw at her. And in doing so, she showed her devotion to her Father in heaven. This story occurs at a particular time in the history of the people of Israel. It happens during the time of the Judges. You'll remember the story of Joshua that precedes the time of the Judges. Joshua, the great warrior leader, had done his job and led God's people into the land flowing with milk and honey. The covenant relationship was working. The people were experiencing their God, and for their part, they were being his people. But Joshua covered a period of approximately 30 years. The account of the Judges stretches over 200 years. 30 years of getting it right, followed by 200 years of getting it wrong. The Judges are the nation's heroes, the champions, warriors who took up the challenge of fighting off the ever-increasing encroachment from the tribes they had scattered. The Israelites of the Exodus who took over Canaan never properly carried out God's instructions to drive out all of the tribes there. Some stayed, and eventually the worship of other gods began to creep into the Israelites' worship. There began to be a breakdown in discipline, and a growing apathy, and increased lawlessness. Does that sound familiar at all? I suppose you could say that they found themselves in the midst of a multicultural, multi-religious society, and they lost their way. Sound familiar? It could be a picture of Western society at the beginning of the 21st century, could it not? Lots of competing ideologies, politics, religions, cultural norms. Pick a few bits from here and there, cobble it together and believe what you like. And this brings us to the point of the story of the book of Ruth. This short but very beautiful and peaceful story is set amid the violent times of the Judges. It provides a warm and loving contrast to the world in which it happens. It's the story of how an outsider, a woman, overcame adversity. Ruth is a Moabite woman married to an Israelite as a result of the intermingling of the various tribes. When her husband dies, Ruth shows uncommon loyalty to her mother-in-law, Naomi, refusing to leave her. And she shows great devotion to the God of Israel. As she is gleaning for leftover harvest grain, a kind of scavenging for scraps, she meets Boaz, who is a distant relative of her late Israelite husband. Boaz is a landowner. He's a man of some standing. Moved by her loyalty, he clears the way to marry her, which is a very unusual and bold step for an Israelite man in his homeland to take. And here's the great twist in the tale. It is Ruth, the Moabitess, in other words, the foreigner, who becomes the great grandmother of David, who becomes Israel's greatest king. Isn't that just wonderful? After all the struggles and battles and wars, with God having to discipline his people for forsaking him and worshipping false gods and other nations, it is a woman from another nation who shows such devotion and loyalty that she becomes an integral part of the Israelite family line. It's almost as though God is saying to them, and therefore to us also, it's not whose name you bear, or the background you come from, or the colour of your skin that is important. It's the love in your heart, the will to do what is right, and your devotion to me that is important. Boaz marries Ruth according to the custom of the kinsman redeemer. This custom was very important in Israelite culture. The kinsman redeemer was responsible for redeeming, buying back family property that had changed ownership. And he was responsible for saving, through marriage, the widow of a male relative, thus preserving the family name through their children. Now, in stark contrast to the general time of the Judges, the book of Ruth shows us a community that did what was right in God's eyes and therefore were able to overcome the problems they encountered. It is the story of God's grace in the midst of difficult circumstances. There are people who follow God and through whom God works, even in times of crisis and deepest despair. There are people who are able to overcome the problems that life throws at them. No matter how discouraging or antagonistic the world may seem, there are always people ready to follow God. And he will use anyone who is open to him to achieve his purposes. And of course, it's through the actions and the attitude of Ruth that we learn about our relationship with God. It's Ruth's commitment to the God of Israel and the people of God's community that gives us such a wonderful example to follow. Though an outsider, Ruth adopts the practices of this people of God that she marries into. Though she has the opportunity to walk away from her family and those who've supported her, her mother-in-law Naomi, she shows nothing but loyalty to her. Though she falls on hard times, the death of her husband and the ensuing poverty, she never gives up hope and never turns to despair. Instead, she overcomes. And in Boaz, we see a foreshadowing of the redemptive work of Jesus Christ. Though Ruth shows loyalty and devotion, she is outside the people of God. She is unable to do anything to change her status before God. But Boaz's willingness to pay the price for her foreshadows Christ's payment for our salvation on the cross. And so in this beautiful story of love and kinship and devotion and honour, we see lived out in the face of social difficulties and political times. We can see an example of the Christian way, the Christ-like life that our society needs to overcome the hurt and pain we might suffer, to repair the brokenness we might endure, and to redeem the right way, the righteousness of God to us. Through this simple story of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, we see God working out his purposes for the whole world. Because of that, we can be assured that God takes an interest in our simple life stories. He can help us to overcome the difficulties in life that we face. Each one of us is integral to his plans, and through us, he is continuing to work out his purposes for his world. The question for each of us is, are we going to remain as faithful and loyal and devoted and loving as Ruth was? Amen.